My name is Ron Bradfield Jr. I am a Bard Joey Umba, that is, I'm a Bard Joey saltwater man of the saltwater peoples that are outside of Broome, up the tip of Cape Lebeek, in a place called, between a place called Jarajin and Arilun. Saltwater country for the Bard and Joey people, Bard people being the mainland people and Joey people being the island people. And we have been a people who have lived together for a long, long time. But I didn't grow up in that business. Yeah. My mother is a stolen generation woman. I'm her oldest son. She was taken when she was very, very, very young, probably around 3 or 4, kept until she was released. No, that's probably not the right word. Let's say absconded. It's a better word. At about 19, when she ran away to marry my father down here in the south. And my father is a Ngaria man, a white man, who was a young 19-year-old baby teacher sent to teach in Port Hedland in the early 60s, and had no idea that there was a world out there separating Aboriginal people from white people and building laws around it, and hence that there was infrastructure already in place that kept one group of people in one place and another group of people, in the other. He arrived in Port Hedland, took up a teaching role in Port Hedland, working in high schools originally. And he discovered within his first term of teaching, I guess, that he had a bundle of students' names on his student roll, his nominal roll, but he never saw a lot of those students. And clearly drummed into him at a fairly early part of learning to become a teacher, he understood that his responsibility was to meet the parents of children who were in his care and have conversations with them about how their kids were going at school. But he'd never met any of the parents either. And when he asked the principal about those students and those parents, the principal just said, "Don't worry about that, Ron. It's not your problem. You can go about just teaching the kids that are in your class." And my father was never somebody that took well to being brushed off, and he knew a good brush off when he saw one. And so he asked a few more questions and discovered that actually all of the children on the list that weren't in his classroom and that he hadn't met or seen were all Aboriginal children, all of them. And that they lived over the other side of the water pipe in a place in the outskirts of Port Hedland town then, on the reserve where the blacks were kept. And the rules were pretty strict still at that time, even for a place like Port Hedland, that, come sunset and sunrise, the blacks were back in the reserve. Those who had permits could be outside of it, but never the two should meet. And of course, that just wasn't the way things were, especially in the Kimberley and the Pilbara. Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people had been mixing for a long, long time. It was very different to what was the case down in this way in Noongar country, where for the Noongar people of this place, this is ground zero for when colonisation happened here in Western Australia, and they were slammed. Very, very different set of circumstances. Nonetheless, violent, invasive, life-changing. But for all of the Noongars in Noongar Budja, they had full-on occupancy from day dot. They were invaded, an occupying force took over their lands, governments were put in place, people divvied it up and started breaking it up into parts for settlers and others who decided that this is what they would have and that's what the others should have. And Noongars here in the southwest of Western Australia were, for want of a better word, contained pretty quickly. And as that occupation moved up the coast and impacted upon other places, other people were affected. And mostly, again, by sea at that time. So Cossack was a port just below Port Hedland. That was the original town in which pretty much the Kimberley and the Pilbara was invaded and occupied. Everything came through Cossack at that time and built and grew all of the so-called opportunities for the white men who went out into those places and then took over whatever it was that they wanted. Port Hedland was a town that grew up on that. Port Hedland was a mining town, well north of here, probably about 3,000 kilometres north of here, if that. And that's where my mum and dad met, oddly enough. Yeah. But prior to that, my father had a really rude lesson about how it was that Aboriginal people were treated up there, as opposed to what he'd seen down here, because he was from down in this country. My father was a Fremantle boy at the times when even this suburb that we're in now this was an army training camp just here to my left. And in fact, the army training camp, the park was cleared as a result of that, but all of this was an army training camp through the First World War and the Second World War, and the engineers had reclaimed all this land and used it for that. Anything else that folks coming back from the wars did after that was they basically got to cut and clear their own blocks of land and move into their own houses in this area around the place, as veterans could then. So my father grew up down here. Needed his bit of adventure as a young bloke, shot through and went up north, had a word from his brother-in-law, who happened to be a pilot then for, oh goodness me, I can't remember the name of the airline then, but pretty stock standard sort of Australian and regional airways airline then at that time. TAA, I think it was. So, with a word from his older brother-in-law, he disappeared up into Hedland to go and ply his trade as a teacher. And after being fobbed off by the principal, he decided that, no, I'm responsible for these students. They're in my role. I need to meet their parents and I need to assess where they're at and I need to do my job properly. This is what I'm here for. And he was told to leave it alone and not bother them. But his principal wasn't particularly a strong man and my father was a stubborn git, so he took off and decided to go and find out for himself where these kids were. And he told me a story when he found where the reserve was. He stepped over the water pipe and he saw a big sign that basically told you that, no white men were allowed inside this place after a particular set of hours, fined so much pounds and shillings at the time for doing so, because it was still, of course, that kind of currency. And as he was sort of like ruminating on that and thinking about, do I take the step, he just heard this voice on his right saying, "What are you doing here, white man?" And he turned and there was this old Aboriginal fellow there just looking at him. And he sort of got a bit shy and nervous then and went, I'm Ron Bradfield and I teach these kids in my classroom, but I've never met, I have these kids on my roll, but I've never met them. And I was told they're all here in the reserve. And the old man said, "Show me that thing." And Dad showed him the roll and the old man could quite clearly read, nodded his head and looked at the old boy and said, "Well, this is a first. You want to meet these kids and their parents, eh?" And my dad sort of was in for a penny, in for a pound, he said. So, yeah, I do. And so that old man took him around that afternoon and introduced him to the parents and the kids. And for the first time, my father got a good glance at what it was that Aboriginal people were being kept in, that were called a reserve at the time. One tap for the entire community, one wash-up point, huts and other things that people lived in if they made it themselves, if they could. Everything was, something that could be pushed over in a heartbeat, and people only ever had what they needed. But where it was meant that people could still go and fish and get fresh tucker from the mangroves and do all the things that they needed to do to keep themselves, going as well as they could without relying on white authorities at the time. And my father just took it seriously. He introduced himself to the old man, said he wanted to meet the kids. And from that time on, my father did something that his principal couldn't stop, and I think probably boggled a lot of people's minds. He would teach the white kids in the classroom during the day, and then he would take the same lessons over to the reserve and teach the Aboriginal kids in the reserve, so that they too had an education, and that he got to talk to their parents. And if that meant that he went fishing with them when they went fishing for salmon, or if he went down when they were looking in the mangroves and other bits and pieces, that's where he did his lessons. He said he had a fun time just trying to discover what it meant to be an actual teacher, in a time where there are very clear laws against that sort of thing. Somewhere along the lines, he took over coaching the basketball team, the school's basketball team. And for the first time, he saw other Aboriginal students, because the gun players of basketball in that town were all Aboriginal. And so suddenly Dad was the coach for the women's basketball team. And then this mob come down from the Kimberley and trounced the Port Hedland mob. And that's when my old man saw this tall woman who could play like that. Too deadly. And figured out he probably should try and figure out her name. And over time, they got to know each other, and they kicked off in a legal relationship. So much so that the police and everyone else who's concerned were keeping an eye on it. And like every other white man, pretty much up there, there isn't a lot you get challenged on. White men could do and take whatever they wanted. That wasn't necessarily my father, but that's the history of the place that speaks to the violence that all of these communities actually grew from. We use the word stolen generation, generations, in a way to avoid talking about how that thing came to be in the first place, or how those stolen generations came to be in the first place. And, you go and look into the records, and I have done, and I've read bits in and around this as part of my own learnings in and around the law that shaped the nature of these things here in Western Australia and across Australia. And you find out that at the time there was a rather embarrassing problem. Suddenly there was a large number of bastard children about that happened to be half-caste, and the government didn't know what to do with them. And certainly the men that had brought about those children by taking what they wanted from Aboriginal women weren't taking any responsibility for them. And prior to Australia becoming a nation, each of the different colonies were responsible for governing themselves and put in place their own legislation and law around this stuff. And we're starting to figure out, what do we do about all these bloody children about the place? 1901 comes around, the colonies, the states and territories come together, federate, become a nation called Australia. And a new act here in Western Australia is drafted up and put into place called the 1905 Act, Aboriginal Protection Act, supposedly to protect the well-being and life of Aboriginals for a better future. And I'm paraphrasing, but honestly, if you read the first paragraph that gives you an idea of what the act is meant to be, if you don't laugh very hard about that, you'll cry, because it's not true. All of the acts pretty much around the states were considered to be protection acts. All of the acts, of course, didn't do anything of the sort. What they did was protected the interests of the states, governments, and people who were divvying up space at the time. In those days, that was land, divvying up land for farms and stocks, for stations, so that people could, build their empires out there in the scrub on cattle or sheep. None of it was about protecting Aboriginal people. None of it was about protecting Aboriginal people's rights to their lands. None of it was about actually protecting the children who were the byproduct of white men not keeping their pants up around black women and making more babies and more babies. And for those who think that, most of that might have been a nice thing, you don't know the history of the world that well. An occupying force of any kind very rarely asks nicely for the things that it takes when it arrives and settles into a place and calls it its own. And that's the history of armies and colonisation the world over. We're no different. We're just much younger at it. And as a result, there's a whole swag of us across Australia as Aboriginal Islander people who know the truth about what stolen generations actually means. And we have a whole government, thanks to John Howard, that doesn't speak to that truth. Reinvented it, called it something else, and made it something that a nation perhaps then shouldn't have to apologise for. Thankfully, we've got better politicians have stepped in since John Howard and accepted the responsibility for those things, but it's one hell of a political football, isn't it? Yeah. And my mum was taken under those circumstances. Born not too long after the Second World War. Taken probably somewhere close to 1950, maybe shortly after. My mum remembers a big army truck pulling up, door slamming as the big white nun came around the side and picked her up where she was playing out there in the bush with some of her cousins on the path, and just picked her up, put her on the back of the truck with all the other children sitting in the back of the truck, and the tray was shut, the door was slammed and the truck drove away. That's all she remembers, that really. It's like she remembers a series of doors and gates closing, And the way she speaks to me, she remembers that door slamming shut, tray opening, the gate opening as the children were sort of filed through it into the building in Broomtown. I think then was called the orphanage. And the doors closing on this group of children, who were the first group of children fresh group of children to come into that place at that time. And you were all pushed into one room and kept there until you stopped making noise, basically. So you stopped crying, you stopped protesting, you stopped, wanting your mum. She remembers not being allowed to speak a language. None of them were. They were all told time and time again, your mum doesn't want you, your dad doesn't want you. Don't speak your language, speak English. Every time you speak your language, we'll punish you. And they did. They had an old woodshed out the back in the middle of the bits and pieces. They would lock the kids in the tin box if they spoke language or if they did anything. That was the punishment. And they would cook out there, up in that place. And they would be taken back inside. And of course, with that sort of thing at a young age, you adapt, don't you? So she did. And they all learned to speak incredibly well, good English. You'd have thought that they were perhaps taught by someone who'd come across from India where they spoke better English. No irony lost there at all, by any means. And not bad considering that really the people that ran that place were the nuns, and most of them were Irish nuns who'd come from Ireland and gone through all their bits and pieces and terror and horror. And of course, knew how to terrorise and put the wind up kids and flog them like you couldn't believe. They'd had a lot of practice back in Ireland. Mum, for the most part, remembers playing basketball as a good thing. It was an opportunity to get away from the orphanage. My mum is the type of sports person that if you actually just gave her any ball, still now, even though she's in her 70s, late 70s, she could automatically just have it sit the way it should sit in your hand as you're about to pass it or sink it or kick it. She's just naturally gifted, always was. Pick it up, play it. And so she was known to be A grade, beautiful player. Back when they actually played sports, she'd like to say, rather than just technology. And basketball as it goes. Yeah, but she met this white man, and they got to know each other. And they got to enjoy each other. And somehow they got to stick together. And when my father left Port Hedland to take up another teaching position further down south, in a town in Northampton where I was actually born, he decided to invite her to come down and asked her to marry him. Neither of the two of them actually ever thought that through that hard. And it was probably timely as well, because I reckon I wasn't too far behind. And there might have needed to be a marriage in order to justify the firstborn boy. But they did. And I remember reading the letter where he sent off to her, inviting her to come down. And at 19, she packed her bags. The year that she turned 19, she packed her bags and just not very much at all. Left, got on a bus, went down. And the next thing they know, they're down here in Perth, over here in Adelaide, Adelaide, which is in a suburb that's not far away. And my father's mother had a church that she used to attend there, my grandmother then. And she wasn't at all happy that her white son was marrying an Aboriginal woman. And somehow her priest decided that he would become an ally, and he was the one that married them. Which, there's a whole other story in itself. They moved up to Northampton, and not too long, in August, I was born. I'm 6'2". There were a lot of people who didn't think I'd make it to that then. Mum nearly died giving birth to me, and I was the youngest premature baby that had survived 24 hours in that old hospital that day, and then went on subsequently to recover, grow, and be here to share a yarn, I guess. It was 1968. The referendum had passed in 1967. Didn't mean anything really in Western Australia. We were still governed by the 1905 Aboriginal Protection Act. And my mother and father lived in what was called a government teacher's house that used to, stay in regional areas. You'd get issued a house for a government worker, and teachers was one of them. I remember bits of that house. I mostly remember smells. I remember falling down the back step, landing on my face. I remember my brother arriving the year afterwards and us living there. And I remember a few years in that early part of our life before we left that place, where my mother lived in constant fear that someone would come and take her children away, just like she was taken away. It was the one big thing that governed every aspect of her life, even to the point today where my mother will still ring to see whether I'm still in the house, whether I've arrived from a certain meeting, whether I've gotten back from a trip. Even today, my mother has this edge of fear, you know, that someone could potentially, possibly take her babies away. My mother's fear was so real in those early years when she was 19 and 20 that when my other brother came along, by the time she was 21, 22, my mother had a drill that as soon as someone knocked on the door, my mum would rush us out the back, push us over the edge of the fence, and we would land to the spare block next door. And my job was to drag my brother into the little cubby house that she'd made, a little hide, you know, in the scrub and bits and pieces there. And we would stay there until my mother came and got us after she'd figure out who the guest was. And I remember all those smells. I remember, you know, just the sense of having to take up that place and drag my brother in there. My brother remembers nothing, but I remember what that felt like and smelt like. That's probably my earliest memories of those things impacting upon us, you know, that time. And not too long after we left Northampton, my father took up a job teaching in Geraldton. And by this stage, my father was also the officer, one of the baby officers looking after an Army Reserve unit in Geraldton, and had decided to move to town so he could take up that position, you know, more full-time and actually look after it better. So we moved, and I remember being in the care of the nuns at a place called Nazareth House. And you can ask, you know, you Geraldton fellas, when you go up to Gero about Nazareth House, especially any of us Aboriginal kids who were taken in there at any particular time. But, God, I tell you what, those Irish nuns were scary. Priests too. The Catholic Church had a huge reach up and down this coast. In fact, the Catholic diocese, we had a Catholic diocese in Geraldton, Catholic diocese in the Kimberley, and a Catholic diocese down in the south here. And the travelling trail back and forth would see priests and nuns and those who'd had relationships with Aboriginal people kept in places at the time, checking on other Aboriginal people as they went up and down that path to see whether things were going okay. My early years of primary school we were still segregated in my first 3 years of primary school here at the school I went to. The bell rang twice. The first bell was to make everybody move, of course. All of us black kids would fall in on the quadrangle and dress, you know, stand in a line ready for inspection, arms apart, ready to be inspected by the nuns and priests. And all of the white kids would line up in front of their classes, ready to go in. And when the second bell rang, the white kids could go into class and the inspection would start for us. And my cousins were in that town by that time, and I remember us all just standing there. It was at least, goodness me, I think at least 20 or so kids, you know, little fellas, grade 1, 2, 3, a few older boys, girls. And we would all fall in, because that was just what you did. Bell rings, fall in the quadrangle. And the nuns and priests would walk past us and make us lift up our face to see if we were clean, open our mouth to see if we were chewing anything, see if our teeth were clean, check our clothes, see if we were wearing shoes, go around again and check the back, see if we were wearing, you know, everything we were wearing was clean, wearing undies, all that sort of stuff. And when the inspection was over, we would wait to be dismissed, and then we would go and stand in front of our classrooms and wait to let in. And we'd sit at the desks at the back, because that's where the desks were for the black kids. And you'd just wait for the day's business to occur. And for me, that was the day's terror, really, because I hated school, hated primary school. I started getting bullied at a very, very early age. My first welcome and I guess racial attack, where I suddenly discovered people using the word bong and coon, abo, was my first week at that school as a grade 1 child. 6? I think you're 5 going on 6 in your grade 1 year here. And I remember going to the toilet and 6 big boys waiting in that toilet, grade 7 boys. And they basically took turns in hitting me and calling me names, and then they held me in the urinal while they took turns weeing on me, teaching me my place as a dirty bum. And setting in place my fear of public toilets from that point onwards until I joined the military. And if it wasn't the kids, it was the nuns. And if it wasn't the nuns, it was some of the priests or brothers. And if it wasn't bullying, it was friendly hands. And if it wasn't friendly hands, it was not so friendly hands. Doesn't matter how you look at it, really, they're all unwelcome hands. And Geraldton is a town made up of migrants, that have contributed to the primary industry up there for all of its life. And they're all the kids I'm going to school with, Italians and fellows from other places in and around those places, Yugoslavians, Croatian families, folks that had all, of course, left their countries as a result of war and have found themselves here. And we're at the bottom of the pile. That's what it is. It's the way of the world, right? I think it's where I first discovered that people could do terribly mean things to others for fun. And one particular Sister Veronica, was one of those people. And she used to like picking out who she considered the crybaby in the class and making them wet their pants. She just was like that. And sitting up the back with us wasn't just, the Aboriginal kids, but the poor kids. The kids that came from families that had no money in the area that the church were helping to look after and take care of. That had to go to Nazareth House to, get looked after while their dad was at work, or while their mum was doing this or that. And Sister Veronica was just not a nice person, sadly. She unfortunately split my head open with a blackboard ruler after I had stitches in the back of my head. I had an accident on the weekend, tussling with my brother over something silly probably. I'd been stitched up. And it wasn't unusual for Sister Veronica to lay into us with her favourite implement. Most kids my age would well and truly remember the metre-long wooden ruler. But she liked to wield it. She liked to wield it at young'uns. She didn't mind bouncing it off our heads. And she hit my head and those stitches went and popped. And that was when my mum and dad finally realised that there was actually really a problem at school. Even though I was terrified to go every single time, I wouldn't. They finally got onto it, So we moved. Yeah, we left. And I went to a state school, one of the state education schools, and that bell rang in year 4. And I ran straight out that quadrangle, boy, I tell you. Too deadly, lots of practice. Fell in on my mark and stood there at attention, ready to rock and roll. I'm waiting for all the other Aboriginal kids that I'd seen in the school. come on, you mop. I'm standing there by myself for probably 10 minutes until this lady comes out of the school office and says, what are you doing? And I said, I'm waiting, miss. Waiting for the inspection. What are you talking about? And I said as much, and she was just going, no, we don't do that here. Where are you meant to be? I don't know, miss. And then for the first time I realised that other places don't necessarily do that, and things have changed. The rest of that schooling was okay, but my high school schooling was trash. I met more racist teachers who shut down all of my first year of high school. I was only allowed into 2 classes in high school, really. 3 if I was lucky. Maths, English and woodwork. The rest, the teachers could just go, no, we don't have anything, so, and they could kick us out. There's a story to that, but it's too long for now. Year 9, though, didn't get that round of teachers. You know, it was with high school, you'd get a round through that and then might repeat again. So I didn't get them in year 9, but I got them again in year 10, and we all spent time out of the classroom. I repeated year 10 at another school, only to find out that that school didn't support that kind of behaviour, didn't have a principal that liked to cane Aboriginal children, and actually had a principal that understood and knew this community really well and knew kids by name in the yard. Blew me away. I repeated year 10, bided my time till I could run away and sign a dotted line in TAFE, actually, where I did my pre-apprenticeship as an electrician and did my electrical trade. And of course, by this time, it's coming up to the mid-80s, and I finished my trade and I put on an army uniform for the first time. I joined the Army Reserve in town. And prior to that, I'd been a naval cadet through my high school years. It's probably the thing that kept me alive, actually. And I discovered the incredible power of disappearing in a uniform. I found that I could just hide in plain sight and no one would see me. No one could see the Aboriginal boy. All they saw was the uniform and what they wanted to see. My father was already an army officer by then, a major. My mother had been brought up by nuns. Recruit school was easy. I already knew how to make a bed like you wouldn't believe. And no one was as scary as the nuns that actually terrorised me as a kid. So, you know, someone yelling at me at recruit camp, that was nothing. My mum had 3 boys, and so she made sure that all of us knew how to wield an iron. And she'd been trained by some of the best, or the worst, depending on how you look at it. And my father was a soldier and he knew all that game as well, so recruit school, no problems at all. The late 80s came along though, and that's when all of it sort of went to pot. For anyone working in industry, anyone managing building companies, anything big at the time, that was one of the big crashes that we had here in Australia, and probably across the world at the time as things hit. And most of the big building companies and places out there in the world, or out across regional WA, that could possibly employ anyone had gone bust and couldn't. And I was an electrician, having done a few jobs here and there, but couldn't be employed anywhere else. And at the time, the Navy was going, we need electricians. So I put down my army uniform, went sideways, and became a sailor. Yeah, they had a direct entry tradesman scheme, and I joined the Navy in 1991 and stayed there for 6 years. As a sparky, who became a hydraulic tech, working guns and missile systems. Primarily, I served on HMAS West Australia. That was my main deployment and time away. But actually, prior to that, I'd spent time doing jollying, as they say. You just go and do short runs on ships. And I was often sent to ships to go and help test things when ships came back from the Gulf, the first Gulf War. So I worked in maintenance stations, if you like, in FEMA in Sydney, Garden Island there, and Garden Island here in Western Australia, down where we've just come from, actually, down outside of Rockingham. And I sat with other maintenance pods, and what we did was we fixed up broken bits on the ships that came back from the Gulf after they'd copped a good 8 to 9 months of flogging out there on the Ogden. And every now and then we'd take them out and run and put them through the tests so they could get, the sea trials. And I'd be part of a crew that would go out and just help out with that. And then we'd go to the next ship and we'd start the job all over again as they went through their repairs, and that ship was deployed and off it went. I got back here in the West probably in 1994 and I finally got off Westralia. And by then I'd decided that I wasn't staying. I was jaded for a number of reasons, but mostly what I was really struggling with was how men could get away with mistreatment of women still in the forces. And that became something that I just couldn't be a part of. And eventually I went to night school, did a few other odds and sods of things, and left, not really to look back, until what happened here in 1998 out here in the Sound. And I was sitting in my lounge room just chilling, really, and someone said, "You've got to come and see this." And I was called to another room, and there was my old ship HMAS Westralia with smoke, just black smoke, pouring out of the funnels and out of the hatches on the top deck. And I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it. And then I realised that this was happening now. This was real time, and this was actually happening just out there, out here in our harbour. HMAS Westralia had been through refit, had gone out to steam, out to do some, sea trials. Was it stepping off? It might have actually been deploying, I'm not sure, I can't remember. But it was fully crewed, off it went. And unfortunately, due to some incorrectly installed fuel hoses, fires broke out over the main engines, and those fires killed 4 sailors. Westralia was a small ship comparatively. It was one of our oilers, fuel ships. And what we used to do with Westralia was fuel ships at sea whilst we were underway. Small crew, 90 to 100, tight crew. Yeah, probably a third to a quarter of that crew, women. Rest men. Close crew, Very little bad behaviour, 9 times out of 10 it was dealt with. Not always. And hence the reason why I left when I did, and why I didn't want to continue. But for the most part, most of us on Westralia looked after each other well. And we were a close crew. Not too many people could say that, they served on a ship with that kind of closeness. Tankers are a whole other kind of thing. Westralia was a whole other experience. And fighting fires was what we did. In fact, that happened when I was on there. A fire had sprung out over the main engine. I was aft firefighting crew with a couple of other mates of mine, and we were getting ready to go through the door down into the engine room to fight the fire. The ship was dead in the water. Everybody was mustered up on the cargo deck. And we're missing one bloke. And that's what we were doing. We were going down to probably recover his body. His name was Roger Cooper. Coops, actually. And Coops lives in the suburb over here, and we're all still good close mates. But we fully expected that what we'd be finding is a body and putting out a fire. And one of my jobs as firefighter with the attack hose was to crack the door, crack the hatch basically, brace against it, put the hose in, slam the door shut against it, keep it there, flood whatever we could that was immediately in front of that door. So what we could do is step into at least a space that was relatively safe if there's a fire in behind it. And I've got the handle in my hand, and I'm getting ready to do this, and the damn handle turns in my hand, right, and opens, and the damn thing comes towards me, and I fall on my ass with my kit on, everything on, like a breather, Michael bar and everything else on, drop on my ass, the blokes behind me, they drop on their ass, and we're sort of looking up like this as Coops, with an empty fire extinguisher, steps out and over us and goes, well, fuck that for a lark, and throws the thing in the corner and steps on out and into the space. And we'd seen a ghost. Coop stayed down there and fought the fire by himself. He used 3 or 4 extinguishers, including a big one which was on a trolley down there strapped in. And he went straight down, straight into it. Here's one that raised the alarm and fought the fire and shut it down. Saved our shit. And got out alive. Can't say the same for the others though, sadly. Yeah. Well, the thing is about that ship is that all those fellas, you know, most of them were fellas that I served with and I'd gotten out. And as soon as I saw that footage and realised where it was on the TV, I got in the car and screamed down to the beach, down here. And I remember just screaming to a halt, you know, in the dirt, and just went out of my car straight down to the beach. Right in front of me was West Australia. And by this time, Adelaide had appeared. Adelaide was already, you know, well and truly trying to render aid, swap firefighters, put extra firefighters in, drop them in by helicopter, get others across by small boats and try and do other things to try and help with the fire. Tugs were trying to get aboard, pull it in. And the smoke was just pissing out. And I was in the water up to here. And there wasn't a thing I could do other than, yeah, just scream in absolute rage because I had mates there and I couldn't do a thing about it. It's a funny old thing, life in uniform, isn't it? And that's what I noticed when one of the helicopters broke away, it landed. And I realised that they'd put injured on the helicopter and it broke up and over me and took off. And I knew where it was going because over here was a new hospital called Fiona Stanley Hospital. It was Charlie Hospital, not Charlie Gardner, new hospital next to it. And I just knew that that's where they were off to, and I got back in my car, drenched, dripping wet. Got in my car, slammed it reverse, spun it round. I tell you what, I don't know how I didn't get pulled over by a copper. I was driving like a bloody maniac. Pulled in the nearest car park, just dropped my car right there, right in front of the entrance. Ran inside, and this woman and security woman go, "Hey, how are you? What are you doing here?" And I was going, "Australia. Where are they? Where are they? Where are they?" And she realised then that I was somebody who knew, and she just said, "Children's ward. We're hiding them in the children's ward. Go there." And so I did. Not too far behind me were the cameras and the media and everyone else that they were trying to hold out. And I remember going up that lift and through those doors. And just grabbing the first man I saw that I knew and hugging him and others that I knew to me and just sobbing because they were okay, you know. They were hurt, but they were okay. And I wasn't even in anymore. And it shouldn't have mattered, potentially. But it does. And to this day, it still matters. What does my head in about the nation that we are and about the world in general is that all kinds of men and women can be squeezed by god-awful circumstances. And if you're in the military, that's operational, or it's an incident, or it's all kinds of things where you're at the pointy end and the only thing that matters, the only thing that you're actually there for, it's not a fucking flag, it's not the colours red, white and blue, it's got nothing to do with somebody being white, black or brindle, being gay or straight, being this religion or that religion. It's whether they stand right there and keep you alive in that moment. As mates have done for me on that ship and other places, because that's actually what matters. And that's the stuff we need to remember. Not any of this rubbish that's going on at the moment where we say that person's different because they're not from here, or that person's different because they don't speak English, or they've got this coloured skin, or they haven't got this particular gear in their underpants or otherwise. None of that matters. Will that person stand behind you and beside you and keep you safe and well, as you'd expect anyone else to do when you go and do a job together? Will that person be a good person in a moment of need? It's been my experience that it doesn't matter what colour they are, but there's a lot of good people out there. I got out of the military and did uni studies for a couple of years, and that's where I discovered just how wrong our nation was in the laws that it set up around Aboriginal people, and how it kept Aboriginal people apart from a growing society that was called Australia, and the knock-on effects of that, and the laws that were in place that allowed my mother to be taken away, and that allowed for me to be treated the way that I was treated. I mean, one of the real reasons that I had to leave Geraldton at the time and join the Navy was that actually I was going to get arrested. Any Aboriginal man about my age, a boy to man, young man at that time in the country town that I grew up in, you're already a target by the time you're 10 years old. The police would fish and try and get us to react. And look, if you got away with a flogging, that's all right, you know. But if they took you to jail, that'd scare the shit out of you. As we already know, thanks to far too many deaths in custody that never actually properly get investigated or addressed. So in order to not be arrested, I picked another uniform and went sideways. And it was probably the smartest thing I ever did. I was still angry. I was very angry. I got angry all over again when I found out what it was that actually allowed for all those things to happen, and I burned with a white-hot anger. And it was actually my old Australia mates, after about probably 12 months of me studying at uni, he said, "Mate, Brad, I don't get it. Since you got out, you just become more black. You know? What's going on?" And then I realised that they didn't know. You know? They had no idea. I didn't know that that's how it was. They didn't know as much as I didn't know. And when I turned around and I said, my mum was taken when she was such, and I explained, there was laws in place that did that. And thankfully, my friend then, who was married to my other mate, she'd met my mum many times, and they, couldn't believe that my mother had been subjected to that sort of stuff at that time, and that my life was this, and that uniform actually had saved me from going to jail. Even when I was in the Navy and in the Army, if I took off the uniform in certain places, I was just another Aboriginal target. I remember getting, just finished doing some work on some patrol boats in the small boat harbour in Sydney Harbour. Basically, it was another base up the Sydney Harbour that was for small boats only, and we just finished for the day, and me and my mate just got back into our civvies. We were going back to the tri-service accommodation that all of us singlies lived at, and we stepped up and out the gate. He went straight over to the corner deli so he can buy himself a packet of durries because he'd run out for the day. And I was just looking at this wonderful new Mercedes-Benz that was parked off to one side, just going, wow, look at that cool car. And I'd probably done one circuit of it before the police car turned up. And that's when I found myself just up against the wall, arms being, ripped down, handcuffs being put on, not a word said, just get your ass over there, get in the car. And, just not fighting it because I knew that if I fought it, I was stuffed. There was no point in trying. And as they were pushing me into the back, the police car, that's when my mate came out from the deli and he went, Oi, what are you lot doing? And that's when the cop said, piss off, mind your own business, it's got nothing to do with you. No, we've just finished work at the base down below, right? Did you check his ID? The cop said, fuck off. Mate was adamant, said, no, check his ID. Check his ID, mate. We're in the Navy. Check his ID. Well, that's when the copper pushed me over and hoisted out my wallet, pulled out my Navy ID, threw it in my lap, and clicked and said, fuck off. They drove away. Those things weren't unusual. And the people that probably stood up for me in those times were my mates who weren't Aboriginal. Didn't really know that was the stuff sort of going on until they saw it. And when you're living a life in uniform, you're all that uniform, you're all that, you're a soldier, you're a sailor, you're this, you're that. You'll hear people talk about this all the time, there's only one colour, It's not true, but I understand their sentiment. But, yeah, I had a pretty good life in all of that, like most of the fellas I knew, if anything, one was stupid enough to start something, most of my mates would shut it down. Including a bar where a bloke wouldn't serve me, and my Navy mates just pulled the bar apart. And we left. I was very embarrassed, actually. I couldn't believe that these fellas had done this. And I was also scared shitless because I was the only bloke who'd probably get pulled over for it and arrested for it. And that almost happened the next day. Cops came looking for me. They pulled up at the base, and the state copper talked to the Navy copper on board and went, I'm looking for this bloke. He's Aboriginal, caused a fight and trashed a bar up the road. And I was called down to the front office, down to the docky copper's office and the front gate. And the chief stood there looking at me, looked at the copper and said, we've got no Aboriginals here, mate, just sailors. I think you fellas should leave. And sent me back on my way and didn't say a thing about it. First time I'd ever seen a copper actually stick up for me in my life. Had to be a Navy copper. Weird lessons to learn, you know. All arse about face, and all completely in the face of the racism that exists in this country, the way it does. And that's why I make. I started, when I got out of the forces, I started actually working with young people at risk of harm, young people who are falling through the gaps at school, young people that are hurting themselves, taking part in really dangerous behaviour, suicide attempts and other things, and street gangs. I was just working with all those kids that had been bumped out for one reason or the other because dad had racked off, or these teachers had said, nah, you're a useless piece of shit, you're not going to work at this school, get out. And they did, they said all kinds of things like that. And I did that for a number of years until it was also me working with their parents and others in similar boats. And I spent a long time working with folks who are going through those tough parts in their lives, you know. And what I found out, and what I'd always known, was that some of the best ways to help and to respond at a time when someone was in that place in their life was to let them sit and be in their own story. And I became someone who just listened, only to realise that actually that's what I'd been pretty much most of my life, and why I had such good friends still in uniform, both the Army and the Navy, is because I'd been there for them as a pair of ears that didn't judge, just sat and listened and stayed consistent and was there. Helped a lot of mates out of some difficult circumstances, mates who'd nearly taken their lives. Some who were planning on it and trying to figure out ways. Some that did. You know, I was just somebody who slowed that down some until they finally made their own decision and did. And I discovered that what I really was somebody who sat in other people's stories. And what all my mob have ever been are storytellers, true storytellers, and have sat and lived in their stories. And I actually have some actors, family members who've been actors and been in Brand New Day and various other things across the place, and had a couple of playwrights, my uncles, and talented family members, and they just encouraged me to, you know, go and find out how you can be a storyteller. And my Uncle Bumba, he said, no, you be your own storyteller, just like we've been. But you decide how you want to do that. And from that day I decided I'd be a today's storyteller. I'd be today's Blackball. I wasn't going to be some Dreamtime storyteller. I wasn't going to be somebody that was always going to be used to come out and get your didgeridoo out the closet and put your lap on and sit around that fire and tell you a Dreamtime story. Because I still get expected to do that today. I still arrive at places where people think I'm going to go and do a costume change and come out already for a ceremony. It's bizarre. Where today's people, like every other person that lives in this society and around the world, and I couldn't quite figure out why it was that there was this want to keep us from being that. And so I set about being a true storyteller. Yeah. And that became my practice, really. Art was just making stories. I'm a tradie, I can make stuff. And all I did was starting bringing things together. You know, I started originally by working on the stage, sitting in stories, telling stories that people wouldn't necessarily consider were true stories coming from an Aboriginal person. I still have people who tell me, you couldn't have served. Aboriginal people didn't serve in our forces. You know, people still believe that. People still believe all kinds of weird stuff about who we are. And our education system still tells them that, broadly, you know. If you look up Aboriginal in most of the textbooks still out there, I'm sure that the same picture that was there when I was introduced to the topic of being Aboriginal, when I was in high school, and there was that thing called social studies, and there's that fella standing on his spear in the desert. with his knee up, foot on his knee, It still hasn't changed that much, We still get introduced as a yesterday's people rather than a today's people. And Australian society doesn't quite know what to do with us as a result of that. A big part of what I do mostly, though, is help people share stories together. Because the truth of it is really, as I said before, we can all sit in our stories together as people. Nothing stops us from doing that. We can decide whether we do that well, and with a bit of decency, or we can decide that we can be ugly about it and be a bigot, be racist, be all those other things that are just ugly that we don't need out there. And there's more than enough of it. But the truth is, I think, and I believe, and this is why I do what I do, is that most Australians, we really aren't like that. I'd really love to sit in a nation that celebrates all of our survival stories, rather than just ignores one of the biggest that exists on this continent. Because there's not one other person that's come here whose peoples haven't had to run from something. And here, for the most part, they can be safe. In Meekatharra, there used to be this old Aboriginal man that used to sit in the corner of the bar, one of the bars we used to sit in. And I could never quite understand why he never got given, short shift and get turfed out by the fellow who used to run the kitchen, who was a Vietnam veteran. Until one day he was yarning to us, and we were talking about life in uniform, old man, myself and Chris was the cook at the time. But this bloke, turns out this old fella had been a Korean War veteran. And he just turned around, and we were just talking about all sorts, but he just turned around and said to us, you know what, you can't kick, and it was back then, you can't kick any white fellas out of this country now. They bled and cried and died alongside of us in all kinds of different things. And we deserve to live together now. And I just thought, that's a remarkably poignant take on things, given where this old man was in Meekatharra, the things he experienced back then, the 50s through the Korean War, but what he would have grown up in order to go out of the way. Most of those old fellas from then, and because of that Protection Act, are all around this country. If you didn't have a fixed address that you could get your medals sent to when you were serving, your medals would go to the recognised next of kin right up until the 1905 Act finished its business. All of the different protection acts around the country, the state government's native welfare department was the next of kin for all Aboriginal people and Islander people. So if they didn't get their medals, it was sent to that department, not sent to the Aboriginal people on the reserve, or that soldier, or this person, or that odds and sods. None of it was actually returned to those people. If you didn't get awarded your medals and recognised for your service whilst you were with your unit at that time that everybody got theirs, you were unlikely to ever see yours during that time. And we fought in all the wars alongside of our Garia, Wajila Whitefella, compatriots, colleagues and mates since the Boer Wars, and continue to do so today. And we're still good enough to sit in our stories in this country. It's an interesting thing. We're architects, we're doctors, we're nurses, we're all of the things that everybody else is in this country. We're travelled, we're experienced. We're in the deep deserts, and we're in some of these pokey, horrid little bloody apartments that you call homes in these cities. We're Australians, whether we like it or not, and we're today Australians alongside of every other fella who comes here and puts their foot down in this country to call it home. It's just that our stories were here first. And it's time a nation properly came to terms with that so that our stories could come together as a peoples, as Australians. Imagine if what we did was take your stories and how you arrived here and let that sit and settle in the stories of my old people and how it was that I arrived here, so that it became a story of us as a peoples who called this place home in Wajak Noongar Budja, this land, the Wajak clan. How much richer would we be? It saddens me that we have that group of people out there that are willing to be spoon-fed that slop and accept it. But I tell you what, geez, it heartens me that we have smarter, more switched-on younger people ready to step on up and in and go, no, actually, that's not good enough. I want to know about where it is that I live, and I want to put my feet down in this country, and I want to be a part of these stories. And you don't have to be, like we're in Wajak Noongar Budja now, we're in the land of the Wajak clan, Noongar nations. You don't have to be an Aboriginal person to put your feet down in this place and call it your home. This Budja, this country, it'll take you. It doesn't care whether you're black, white or brindle. It expects that what you will do is come and act well on it, like anyone else. And that's all we have to do. And part of the acting well is holding your hands out to others and saying, hi, welcome. And actually being part of a community that holds others up rather than punches down. Look, if the words to live by aren't love, tolerance and kindness to all, what are you doing here? Well, there's nothing else we can do, but actually, we can't fight hate with hate. We can't fight anger with anger. We can't undo what's been done. And I've got good reason to be angry. But that won't make me a good person. So, love, tolerance and kindness for all.